Grysen, and I'm going to give a lecture that I gave to the MIAS Society here in Dallas a few months ago, and my camera wasn't working, so I'm going to try to record it now. But the lecture's on mutations, evolution's engine or evolution's end. And we got to start with evidence. That's what I do as a detective. I look at evidence, and we have to follow the evidence wherever it leads us. And faith is not what the world says it is. It is not blind faith. It is faith based on evidence. That's what it says in Hebrews chapter 11. It's the evidence of things not seen coming to the most reasonable conclusion. So there's faith when you look at the evidence and you come to the conclusion that we evolved from particles in the sea, versus faith in trusting that God created everything. In its philosophical truth, you come to the conclusion of faith. It's a philosophical thing, and there's three tests for philosophical truth. It's logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevancy. It has to add up. It has to have the evidence and enough evidence and explain all the evidence. It also has to be in line with what you've experienced in life, what you are aware of. So Nikola Tesla said, today's scientists have substituted mathematics for experiments, and they wander off through equation after equation and eventually build a structure which has no relation to reality. That's a big problem with science today. They just don't follow the evidence. They come up with a mathematical equation and say that that's evidence. That's logical consistency. You validate it. It's more of a test that something isn't true than that something is true. And they say it is something that is true, and that's a big problem in science. Here's atheist logic. It says this sandcastle came up by chance after a million years of erosions. Experientially, do you say that's happening on the beaches in different places? Could this have happened by chance, or was that by intelligent design? I think the evidence is clear that that is by intelligent design. The big problem is Albert Einstein says the man of science is a poor philosopher. So we got to look at science versus pseudoscience. Real science follows evidence wherever it leads. Claims are conservative and tentative. They consider all the evidence, follow valid logic, changes with new evidence that goes against what you concluded. Pseudoscience starts with a conclusion and works backwards to validate. This is like Darwin, when his story of us coming from sea creatures that formed by chance. He started with this idea that we evolved and worked backwards trying to evaluate. It makes a grandiose claims that go beyond the evidence. He came up with finches' beaks that change. That's his big evidence, and that just doesn't work. That is pseudoscience, because that's a grandiose claim that go beyond the evidence. Cherry picks only favorable evidence and relies on weak evidence. That's exactly what evolution has done since the beginning. It's pseudoscience, it's not science. They use bad logic. They just don't make things add up. They just start with a conclusion and say that this validated. Everything's added up before they start the investigation. And they make dogmatic and are unyielding to change, and that's true. So Darwin had 0 degrees in science, but he had 1 degree in theology, so his idea was actually a pagan belief that dates back to Egyptian times. Evolution is basically a religion repackaged by Darwin to look scientific. I have another video on YouTube on my channel that talks about the origin of Darwin's origin story, and that validates this idea. Darwin's story in evolution has not changed. The basic story goes all the way back to the Sumerians, and just coming from fish to these land creatures, and they just just is not so. Experiential relevancy from super predator to chicken, and this is meant to be evolution. From a dinosaur to a chicken, that's what Darwin said, I guess, so it must be true, but it goes against experiential evidence. Also, the idea of a whale coming from a land creature, that came from Darwin. First of all, it was bears, and now it's some kind of a dog type creature, and recently they came up with a creature that had a whale with hoofs, but all they found was part of a skull, and they came to that conclusion based on that. Just it was made up science, pseudoscience once again. Darwin came up with his scientific fact of evolution. He thought the power of change was pangenesis. Pangenesis is basically desire for change. So if a giraffe desires to have a longer neck, he'll send on information to subsequent generations, and slowly the neck will get longer. And that's how the power of evolution was when Darwin put his theory together. This was proven wrong by the early 1900s, but evolution was a scientific fact, so it wasn't a problem. No one ever questioned Darwin's idea. By the 1930s, they found mutations can change the composition of the DNA, so they proposed they had found the missing power source, and pangenesis was abandoned and mutations took its place. Just some of the validating evidence for evolution changed. The story never changes. So scientists quickly turned to neo-Darwinianism in the hope that it could do that which Darwinianism could not do. The man more responsible than any other for getting scientists on the neo-Darwinian bandwagon was Julian Huxley, but in his writings, he knew that he was on thin ice. Quote from him, "A proportion of favorable mutations of 1 in 1,000 does not sound like much, but it's probably generous, since so many mutations are lethal, preventing the organism from living at all, and the great majority of the rest throw the machinery slightly out of gear." He knew that back then. It was a big problem. Another quote, "One would expect that any interference with such a complicated piece of chemical machinery as the genetic constitution would result in damage, and in fact, that this is so. The great majority of mutant genes are harmful in their effects on the organism." But he still went forward, pushing for neo-Darwinian evolution. Ernest Mayr was another one who fought with Huxley, and here's a quote from him. It says, "The occurrence of genetic monstrosities by mutation is well substantiated, but they are such evident freaks that these monsters can be designated only as hopeless. They are so utterly unbalanced that they would not have the slightest chance of escaping elimination through stabilizing selection. The more drastically a mutation affects the phenotype, the more likely it is to reduce fitness. To believe that such a drastic mutation could produce a viable new type is equivalent to believing in miracles." That's what it is. Believing in evolution is believing in miracles. Mutations. What are mutations? Well, mutations are accidental copying errors in the DNA and RNA transcription copying process that lead to structural changes. This DNA comes apart and they build a new DNA. It spins at the speed of an aircraft engine. If there's one part that isn't in the right spot, a different part comes in, it stops. And they'll take that part out and put the right part in. After it's all done, they have 2 machines that go over it. There's 30 machines in the whole cell that are all necessary, but the 2 machines go over it to fix any mutations. So mutations are not very often happen in the copying process, but they still do happen. The prime axiom of evolution states that natural selection of unguided random mutations has taken life from that first cellular organism to the great genetic diversity we see in our planet today. That's all part of it, and it's all been done by random mutations. It's time plus chance. Random means chance. Is it the engine of evolution? That's the big question. Ernest Mayr says that it must not be forgotten that mutation is the ultimate source of all genetic variation found in natural populations and the only new material available for natural selection to work upon. It's saying it's the only engine of change. Here's C.H. Waddington. It remains true to say that we know of no other way than random mutations by which new hereditary variation comes into being, nor any process other than natural selection by which the hereditary constitution of a population changes from one generation to the next. I wanted to make the case that mutations are the engine. They definitely are the engine of evolution. There's different types of evolution. There's a deletion that removes a chromosome section, a duplication that repeats a section that you can see it duplicates over here, and then there's an inversion where they flip over, and a translocation moves a segment from one chromosome to another, non-homologous one. So it takes it out and moves it from one part to the other. The deletion and insertion are basically what you need for a positive change, but there's no type of where they put in a different thing. It's all just a duplication or an inversion or a translocation and a deletion. They just don't add any new information the way evolution would need it to happen. And there's also something called the back mutation. A lot of the evidence that claim mutations can do these great things are actually back mutation, and this is a mutation that reverses the effect of a previous one called the back mutations and could at one stroke revive a complex function that had earlier shut off. The mutation must have turned on what had been existing but dormant system. So like the finch's beaks, it changes, and it changes with what's going on the outside, and it's not random. It seems to be by design, and that is done by back mutations. It's information that's turned off and turned on, but it doesn't create any new information the way mutations need to. Can mutations create new information? Well, they can. We have a lot of animals from Chernobyl where they had the radiation released, and we see extra legs on a cow. Does this make it a better cow? Two-headed goat or whatever it is, that doesn't make it a better goat. Four-legged deer, two-sided turtle, and here's some mutations that they did a lot of work on fruit flies, and we see how some mutations worked, and what happened is where there was an antenna, a leg came out instead, and where there was a halter, there came an extra set of wings, but they're all totally useless. They don't make any advantage at all. And they did a lot of experiments over a lot of years with fruit flies, and they just didn't prove anything as far as mutations. These examples and all others examples of mutation-enhanced function quoted in the scientific literature involve loss, jamming, or mere duplication of genetic information. No novel, more complex genetic information that adds higher level of function has been added to these organisms. There's 4 special problems of mutations. First, rare effects. Mutations are rare because it has all those protective measures. And this point is not a guess, but a scientific fact observed by experts in the field Their very rarity dooms the possibility of mutational evolution to oblivion. This is probably fair to estimate the frequency of a majority of mutations in higher organisms to be 1 in 10,000 and 1 in a million per gene per generation. That's by F.J. Ayala. And they're very rare. He said maybe 1 in 10,000 to 1 in a million. I think it's closer to 1 in a million. Second problem, random effects. Mutations are always random and never purposeful or directed, except for back mutations. And this has repeatedly been observed in actual experiments with mutations. They never are purposeful or directed. Here's a quote from Pierre-Paul Gassi in his book, Evolution of a Living Organism. The opportune appearance of mutations permitting animals and plants to meet the needs seems hard to believe. Yet, Darwinian theory is even more demanding. A single plant, a single animal, would require thousands and thousands of lucky, appropriate events. Thus, miracles would become the rule. Events with an infinitesimal probability could not fail to occur. There's no law against daydreaming, but science must not indulge in it. It's daydreaming to believe that mutations can do all these things. Third thing, truth about mutations, problems, evolution, harm, not helpful. Evolution requires improvement. Mutations do not help or improve. They only weaken and injure. Even assuming that all mutations were beneficial, in order for evolution to begin to occur in just even a small way, it would be necessary to have not just one, but a series of closely related interlocking mutations, all occurring at the same time in the same organism. You just get 1 in a million, you'd have to get several of them at the same time. It's just against the odds. The odds of getting 2 mutations that are in some slight manner related to one another is the product of 2 separate mutations, 10 million times 10 million or 100 trillion. That is 1 followed by 14 zeros, 1 and 10 to the 14th. What can 2 mutations accomplish if this were to happen against all possibility? Perhaps a honeybee with a wavy edge on a bent wing, but he would still be a honeybee. He has not changed from one species to another. Hundreds of thousands of mutation experiments have been done in a determined effort to prove the possibility of evolution by mutations, and this is what they've learned. Not once has there ever been a recorded instance of a truly beneficial mutation, one which is a known mutation and not merely a reshuffling of latent characteristics in the gene, nor such a mutation that was permitted passing from one generation to another. Just the evidence isn't there. Here's from A. Coulter. Each mutation occurring alone would be wiped out before it could be combined with the others. They are all interdependent. The doctrine that their coming together was due to a series of blind coincidences is an affront to not only to common sense, but the basic principles of scientific explanation. It just is not possible that it could happen. Fourth problem with mutation, harmful effects. Nearly all mutations are harmful. In some instances, mutations weaken or damage the organization in some way so that it or its offspring is able to have any will not long survive. Some of them are pretty neutral and they just don't have any effect. There's none that have good effect. There's no single instance where it can be maintained that any of the mutants studied has a higher vitality than the mother species. It is therefore absolutely impossible to build a current evolution model on mutations or on recombinations. That's by N. Herbert Nelson. Another quote from H.J. Mueller, Nobel Prize for his work in genetic and mutations. It is entirely in line with the accidental nature of mutations that the extensive tests have agreed in showing the vast majority of them detrimental to the organism in its job of surviving and reproducing. Just as changes accidentally introduced into any artificial mechanism are predominantly harmful to its useful operation, good ones are so rare that we can consider them all bad. Another quote from T. Domzhansky: a majority of mutations, both those arising in laboratory and those stored in natural populations, produce deterioration of the viability, hereditary disease, and monstrosity. Such changes, it would seem, can hardly serve as evolutionary building blocks. It's a huge problem. A few examples of often quoted examples of beneficial mutations: antibiotic resistance in bacteria. And this has been proven wrong. It's a case of survival of the fittest, but the resistant bacteria were there before. In fact, in a frozen sailor that was frozen in the 1830s, they took him and did an autopsy on him and found the antibiotic resistance in his stomach. This was over 70 years before they started using antibiotics. So it was survival of the fittest. It's not any mutation that made it stronger. Lactose tolerance in Europeans. Do you have to prove that not having milk as an adult is a better thing that would lead to anything better? Maybe it turns out that it's best that adults don't have it, and so it's not a bad thing, but it doesn't make the organism any better. Resistance to HIV, this is slightly more resistance, which would be a good thing. A better thing would be to avoid HIV conduct that exposes you to HIV, but this was already in the genes. It wasn't something that evolved. Sickle cell anemia was a big evidence, and actually it just gives you slightly better resistance to malaria and makes the human much more sickly and causes huge problems. None of these are any kind of good evidence for good beneficial mutations. All fail to meet the requirements of increasing genetic complexity mutations. Assumptions of evolution. And these are all things that would have to be done. The only engine is mutations. The first assumption is that non-living things gave rise to living material, i.e. spontaneous generation occurred. This is a big problem, and they won't talk about it today, but this is an assumption, and the only power they have that they know of is mutations. Mutations couldn't do it. The second assumption is that the spontaneous generation occurred only once over a short period of time. Why is that? Where's the evidence of it? And why don't we see anything like it today? Life processes. Here's some things that all the first life needs to have. It comes from the acronym Mrs. Grysen. They'd have to have movement. All living things move, even plants. Respiration, getting energy from food. Sensitivity, detecting changes in their surrounding. Growth, all living things grow. Reproduction, making more living things of the same type. Excretion, getting rid of waste. And nutrition, taking in and using food. Obviously, Darwinian evolution can only exist if life of some sort already exists. Darwin can offer absolutely no help in explaining that all the important step, the origin of life. But if the central principle of life fails to explain the origin of life, we are left with a problem. What other principle or principles might explain how it all began? This is Paul Davies, professor and physicist, astronomer, astrophysicist. The human genome is incredibly designed. The DNA can be stored, and DNA is that if it was stored in books, the book of the genome would contain 23 chapters, chromosomes. Each chapter would contain 48 to 250 million letters, A, C, G, T without spaces, hence the book containing over 3.2 billion letters total. The book fits into a cell nucleus the size of a pinpoint. At least one book of the one copy of the book, all 23 chapters, is contained in most cells of our body. So it is truly amazing, the human genome. How this all came together by mutations is just amazing. Just, that was on a pinpoint, that nation, but if you put a teaspoon of DNA and had it as a hard drive, all the data in the entire world would be able to be stored on that amount of DNA. It's just totally beyond amazing. The typical animal cell has all these components. It's like a city. As I said, there's 30 different machines going on. They're building things. There are armies of these machines, 30 different types, and all of them have to be there. And just everything it does in the cell wall is all beyond amazing. How this could come together is just beyond amazing. Evolutionist Michael Denton explains, the complexity of the simplest known type of cell is so great that it is impossible to accept that such a object could have been thrown together suddenly by some kind of freakish, vastly improbable event. Such an occurrence would be indistinguishable from a miracle. So the big problem is, and with the Cambrian explosion, is they have bacteria in the bottom, and then you have the cells that come together and form bodies. And anyway, they've done all these experiments, and they just haven't proved anyway how this could have happened. And that's the third assumption, that all viruses, bacteria, plants are all interrelated. Bacteria aren't life. The fourth assumption is that the protozoan, single-cell organism, gave rise to the metazoal, multiple cell organism. Just couldn't have happened. The Cambrian explosion, you have the bacteria below, or the blue-green algae, and then there's 300 fully formed different body plans. They all came together, and the trilobite has eyes and a brain, and it's all impossible that it could have happened in the 5 million year period that supposedly was in between there. I think the fossil record was laid down rapidly during the flood of Noah, not that long ago. Evolutionary biologist Dr. Richard Linsky initiated a long-term experience on February 24, 1988 that continues today. Its goal is to look for genetic changes in 12 initially identical populations of E. coli bacteria that have been adapting to conditions in their flasks for more than 60,000 generations. The results of the study so far, mutations that result in a gain of novel information, have not been observed. They tried to see just a little tiny bit of evidence how it could have happened. It just wasn't observed. It's daydreaming, thinking it could happen. Here's another quote. My attempts to demonstrate evolution by an experiment carried on for more than 40 years have completely failed. At least I should hardly be accused of having started with any preconceived anti-evolutionary standpoint. That's H. Nelson, Synthetic Speciation. Here's T. Dombrowski. The majority of mutations, both those arising in laboratories and those stored in natural populations, produce deteriorations in the viability, heredity, disease, and monstrosity. Such changes, it would seem, can hardly serve as evolutionary building blocks. It's huge problems. The fifth assumption is that the various invertebrate phyla, organisms without a backbone, are interrelated. And anyway, they're all totally different. How they could come and form out of mutations is just beyond impossible. The sixth assumption is that the invertebrates gave rise to vertebrates, animals with backbones. If you understand the impossibility of that happening, it's just, once again, beyond impossible. Seventh assumption is that within the vertebrates, the fish gave rise to amphibia. the amphibia to reptiles, the reptiles to birds, and mammals. So that's supposedly happened by mutations. It's just a story. It's all it ever has been. It's all it ever will be. Just mutations now as the engine just doesn't cut it. How about the most advanced machine on the planet, and just the human body, all that's involved, all the organisms, the skin, the muscles, the nerves, they're all, and they'll tell you that it had no designer. It definitely had to come together by a designer. Charles Darwin himself said it is supposed that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to differential densities, for emitting different amount of lights, and for correction of the spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, seems, I freely confess, observed in the highest degree. It's true. The human eye needs about 40 subsystems all working together in harmony with each other. Logically, they all had to appear instantly together, or we would all be blind. And then it has to be connected to your brain. The eyes, you have two eyes. Why do we have two and not just one? One would be amazing. Two, why two? We have two eyes, each composed of 130 million photoreceptor cells, different kind of cells. Each one of those cells, there are 100 trillion atoms. That's more than all the stars in the Milky Way galaxy, yet some think it happened by chance. The eye is amazing. The human brain has 100 billion neurons. Each neuron is connected to 10,000 other neurons. Sitting on your shoulders is the most complicated object in the known universe. It came together by chance, by mutations, not a chance. Here's a quote from Stephen Smith, professor of molecular and cellular physiology. One synapse by itself is more like a microprocessor with both memory storage and information processing element than a mere on and off switch. In fact, one synapse may contain on the order of 1,000 molecular scale switches. A human brain has more switches than all the computers and routers and internet connections on Earth. Just your brain has more than that. Scientists find evidence of a multi-dimensional universe inside our brain. What they discovered is that the brain is full of multi-dimensional geometrical structures operating in as many as 11 dimensions. We have found a world that we have never imagined, said lead researcher, neuroscientist Henry Markham. There are tens of millions of these objects, even in a small speck of the brain, up through 7 dimensions. In some networks, we even found structures up to 11 dimensions. This is just your brain. The Institute of Health now believes that you have a magnetic electro field that's inside, not contained necessarily by your brain, and they call it the biofield hypothesis. You can look into that. Here's genetic entropy, a big problem for evolution and mutations. What is genetic entropy? It is the genetic degeneration of living things. Genetic entropy is the systematic breakdown of internal biological information systems that make life alive. Scientific theories versus observation. DNA is lost in each and every generation. Where's the evolution in that? There is, it's passed on every generation, less vital genome, slightly less, fortunately, and we can adapt to most of the problems. But Nobel Prize winning grandfather of modern human Hermann Mueller estimated in 1950 that a mutation of a load of 0.3 mutations per individual per generation was the limit of human mutation tolerance. That's all that the human could pass on, and that it could be tolerated, is one every third generation, basically. In 1971, Nobel Prize winner Manfred Egan also calculated the maximum number of mutations allowed for evolution to process as 1 per genome. Any figure above that would eventually result in genetic era catastrophe, a term he coined. So the mapping of the Human Genome Project found that between 100 and 300 mutations were added in each generation. That's a lot more than 0.3 or maybe 1. There's 100 to 300. Stanford believes this information is known but guarded by population geneticists. Humanity is degenerating at a rate as high as 1% every generation. He concludes, we are in a downward spiral. Things are getting worse. Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins and Jerry Bergman reviewed the studies comparing human chimpanzees and DNA. When the entire DNA is taken into account and not just pre-selected parts, they found it is safe to conclude that human chimp genome similarity is not more than approximately 87% identical and probably not higher than 81. Dr. Tompkins, in his own independent comparison, established a similarity to be about 70%. The evidence indicate we do not have ancestors in common with chimpanzees so recently as we have been taught. Also, the Y chromosome, they found only 47% as many protein coding elements as humans in chimps. 30% of the chimps' Y chromosomes lack an alignable counterpart on the human Y chromosome. There's big problems, but that's a story Darwin said, so we're sticking to it. Here's, we know that the accumulation of all these mutations has resulted in 3.6 billion nucleotides of human genome now being corrupt, approximately in our population today. If genetic entropy is true, that would we would expect to see higher quality genomes the farther we go back in history. This is exactly what we find. Recent sequencing of the genomes of a male Paleo Eskimo that lived 4,000 years ago shows that he had about 450,000 nucleotide mutations versus 3.6 million today. Such a rapid deterioration of the human genome is clear evidence of genetic entropy, is also clear evidence of a perfect human genome around 4,000 BC. That's what the evidence points to. Here's a few quotes from doctors that looked at the genome. He said, we are inferior to cavemen. He said the evolution tells us they were stupid. No, they had higher IQs than we did. Dr. Conneval, no human geneticist doubts man is degenerating. Dr. Lynch, even assuming a lower mutation rate, we are degenerating at 1 to 5% per generation. Things are not getting better. Jacob Tennyson, PhD, evolutionary geneticist at Oregon State University. He says evolution and functional impact of rare coding variation from deep sequencing of human genome exomes concludes the degradation couldn't have been going on for a long period of time. He says the maximum likelihood for accelerated growth was a maximum of 115 years ago. I think that's a little bit off because I don't think mutations were as fast as before the flood, but I think he's about right with his thing, and it could have been about 6,000 years ago, actually. Dr. Alexei, he's a professor at the University of Michigan, recognizes that, he says, why have we not died 100 times over? That's if we've been around for 120,000 years or a million years or whatever they say. Lee Spencer says the neo-Darwinianists would like us to believe that large evolutionary changes can result from a series of small events if there are enough of them, but if these events all lose information, they can't be steps in the kind of evolution the neo-Darwinian theory is supposed to explain. No matter how many mutations there are, whoever thinks macroevolution can be made by mutation that lose information is like the merchant who lost a little money on every sale but hopes thought he could make it up on volume. It's just not going to happen. Here's George Wald. Time is, in fact, not the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait for time itself to produce miracles. However, the laws of science suggest a problem with this idea. Those laws tell us very clearly that with time, things degrade. They are not getting better. Scientifically speaking, then, time is the enemy of evolution. It's not its friend. Sweeping gene survey reveals new facets of evolution. For the planet's 7.6 billion people, 500 million house sparrows, and 100,000 sandpipers, genetic diversity is about the same, said Mark Specko of the Rockford University. The study seemed to subvert evolutionary theory in two respects. First, it shows a clear delineation between species, and second, it has almost all species being created at the same time. More evolution for creation, not for evolution. These scientists see the obvious, confirm Darwinian evolution is broken. Darwinian theory is broken and may not be fixable. That was the takeaway from the meeting last month, organized in 2016 by the world's most distinguished historical scientific organization, the Royal Society, which went mostly unreported by the media. The conference did an excellent job of defining the problem with evolutionary theory has failed to solve, but it offered little, if anything, by the way of a new solution to those long-standing fundamental problems. Although the neo-Darwinian paradigm still represents the central explanation framework of evolution as represented by recent textbooks, it has no theory of the generative. In other words, the neo-Darwinian mechanism of mutations and natural selection lacks the creative power to generate the novel, anatomical traits and forms of life that have risen during the history of life. Here's recently 1,000+ scientists publicly signed dissent from Darwinism statement. In the statement, a scientific dissent from Darwinism, in short, a statement that reads, "We are skeptical of the claims of the ability of random mutations and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged." They don't question it in universities. You can get a PhD, they'll tell you it's a fact all the way to the top. And it won't talk about problems, but there are huge problems. Evolutionary theory needs a high rate of beneficial mutations, and for those mutations to create new information over time. Both these assumptions are now clearly false. There are virtually no beneficial mutations. Those that exist create no significant new information. There's not enough time. The prime axiom of evolution, that mutations lead to an upward genetic progression, is therefore a lie. Psalms 102 says, "They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them, and they will be discarded." Isaiah 51:6, "The earth will wear out like a garment, and its inhabitants die like flies. But my salvation shall last forever. My righteousness shall never fail." The solution to creation is Jesus Christ. The solution for the sin problem, the degeneration, is Jesus Christ. Romans 6:22, "For we know the whole creation has been groaning together in pains of childbirth until now, and not only the creation, but we have ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our body." That's if we trust Jesus Christ as our personal Savior, our bodies will be redeemed. That's the only solution to the problem. Trust what He did on the cross, paying the price for your sins. Here's a quote from Arthur Keith: "Evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe it only because the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. The problem is pride. You got to humble yourselves and realize there's a problem and start looking for the solution. The solution is Jesus Christ." Here's a conclusion: upon rigorous examination and analysis, any dogmatic assertion that gene mutations are raw material for an evolutionary process involving natural selection is an utterance of a myth. Evolution cannot succeed without mutations, and evolution cannot succeed with them. Evolution is an impossibility. Only God can make plants and animals. No one else can. And senseless, random, harmful mutations cannot do it either. Mutations are evolution's end. It's not its engine. Mutations are the end of evolution. It's not the engine. That's it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below.